From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.
Good day, this is Dateline Malacañang. Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. signed Republic Act 12316, allowing the executive emergency powers to temporarily suspend or lower excise taxes on petroleum goods in response to rising world oil prices caused by the Middle East crisis. The legislation, which consolidates Senate Bill number 1823 and House Bill number 8220, goes into force immediately after publication. It amends Section 148 of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997, allowing the President, in consultation with the Department of Energy or DOE, and on the recommendation of the Development Budget Coordination Committee or DBCC, to adjust excise taxes when the average Dubai crude oil price based on the mean of Platts Singapore or MOPS reaches or exceeds $80 per barrel for 1 month prior to the issuance of the order. The statute allows for both full suspension and partial reduction of excise duties on particular petroleum products, with the ability limited until December 21, or rather December 31 of 2028. The act requires oil corporations to send monthly cost component data for petroleum products to the DOE, which will then forward them to Congress and the DBCC. The Bureau of Internal Revenue and the Bureau of Customs are also required to provide monthly updates for value-added tax computation. The President is required by RA 12316 to provide reports to both houses of Congress describing the factual basis and policy objectives of the suspension or decrease, the projected foregone revenues, and expected social benefits, and the likely impact on inflation, fuel costs, and the broader economy. Earlier, President Marcos emphasized that the executive will have to choose when is the best time to use that new authority, citing legal requirements. President Marcos' signature comes as global oil prices rise, and it follows his recent declaration of a national energy emergency, which will allow for speedier government interference in supply and pricing. Officials said that the measure will give authorities additional powers to stabilize domestic gasoline costs and reduce inflationary pressures on people and companies.
Dateline Malacañang.
Manufacturers have agreed not to raise basic commodity prices for the time being, Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. said, as the government seeks to mitigate the impact of rising global oil costs on consumers. During a news conference in Malacañang, President Marcos said that producers will maintain current prices as long as stockpiles last. The guarantee comes as global oil price volatility fueled by Middle East tensions threatens to raise production and transportation costs, potentially impacting retail pricing of vital products. The government has been working with manufacturers and industry partners as part of a larger policy to keep prices stable and safeguard consumers, particularly low and middle income households. To avoid pricing pressures from cascading across the supply chain, authorities are implementing complementary measures such as fuel subsidies for important sectors, expanded subsidized food programs, and attempts to minimize logistics costs. To mitigate the impact on consumers, the government is extending food access programs such as free rice distribution by local government units via the Local Government Support Fund or LGSF. President Marcos added that the government is assuring an adequate supply of agricultural inputs, including fertilizer. To further stabilize food prices, the government has cut logistics charges for agricultural items such as roll-on, roll-off, railroad terminal fee, 1 peso, as well as cars transporting agricultural products.
Patuloy din ang ating ibinibigay sa ating mga magsasaka ang fuel at fertilizer subsidies para sa magsasaka at saka para sa mga mangingisda para hindi ipasa yung pagtaas ng presyo ng kanilang ginagamit na krudo hindi mapasa lahat sa mga consumer. At sumagot na ang ating mga manufacturer na hindi sila magtataas ng presyo ng pangunahing bilihin sa ngayon. At hanggat kaya, nangako naman sila, hanggat kaya nila na i-maintain ang presyo. Kasi ang pinagbibili ngayon nila ay yung nasa inventaryo na nila. Nabili nila ng mura pa bago pa nangyari lahat ito. Kaya habang nandyan ang kanilang inventaryo, nangako sila na hindi nila itataas ang presyo ng mga primary commodities. Magsisimula na rin magbigay ang ating mga LGU ng libreng bigas. Ito ay nagsimula, yung LGSF program ito, nagsimula ito bago pa nagkagera. Pero i-roll out ito within the next week or two. So ginamit natin dyan ng LGSF, the Local Government Support Fund. Diniretso natin sa ating mga local government para sila na ang magbibigay ng tulong. Ang ating ang programang ito ay nagbibigay tayo sa bawat LGU ng pondo. At ang hinihingi lang namin sa kanila na minimum 50% ng LGSF fund na natatanggap nila ay gawing pambili ng bigas para maipamigay sa kanilang mga constituent. Maaari nilang gawin 100% na bigas, nasa sa kanila yon. Ngunit kailangan at the minimum 50% doon sa natanggap nilang pondo ay gagamitin sa pagbili at pagbigay ng bigas.
President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. assured the public that the government continues to explore new oil sources, even though the country still has sufficient fuel supply. In his address delivered at the Malacañang Palace, President Marcos said ensuring the availability and stable pricing of petroleum products remains a priority, especially with disruptions in the global oil supply due to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. He admitted that in the early days of the crisis, suppliers were unable to provide clear answers regarding availability and prices due to evolving developments in the global market. He said concerned government agencies are working to ensure that existing oil import contracts are honored, stressing the need to keep the deliveries of petroleum products on schedule. President Marcos said he immediately sought an inventory update from the Department of Energy or DOE on the country's stockpile of diesel, gasoline, kerosene, and jet fuel. Citing the DOE report, he noted that the country has sufficient fuel supply for 45 days. President Marcos said continuous coordination with suppliers and the implementation of new delivery mechanisms have helped stabilize the situation, allowing fuel shipments to continue. He added that he has directed the DOE to continue securing additional oil sources, considering the uncertainties in global oil markets due to disruptions affecting supply routes from the Middle East. He said the government is exploring alternative sources not affected by the conflict in the Middle East. Although long-term supply cannot yet be fully guaranteed, President Marcos expressed confidence that the country will remain stable in the short term. The government, he said, expects not only continued deliveries within the current 45-day window, but also a steady flow of petroleum and related products beyond that period.
Now, we are talking about 45 days on average, more or less. Pero hindi natin alam how long this will last, how long the supply is going to be diminished or from the Middle East to the Straits of Hormuz. So our authorities are all continuing to find new sources for the supply. First of all, what we tried to do was to ensure that the contracts that we already had would be honored, and we are not stopping. Although the average now is running at 45 days supply, siyempre iba-iba, but the average is 45 days. Hindi natin tinitigilan. And again, I credit the success of this ensuring the supply to the good relations that we have with our partner countries around the world. And we have not only gone to our oil suppliers, that are traditional oil suppliers, we have tried to explore other sources that are not affected by the war that is ongoing in the Middle East. And there have been, it would be premature to say that we have perfected contracts with them, but I think it's sufficient to say that the things are beginning to open up. And although we cannot be assured right now of the supply, we can be sure that at least for 45 days we will be all right. I think that we can be fairly confident. We can be confident that after the 45 days, we will still have already arrived here in the Philippines. We will have already a flow of oil, not just one delivery, not just two deliveries, but a flow of petroleum and petroleum-related products.
In President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. has ordered the release of 20 billion pesos in emergency fund to ensure the country has an adequate fuel supply amid the global oil crisis brought about by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. The Department of Budget and Management, or DBM, in a statement said the Department of Energy will receive the emergency fund through a special allotment release order and a notice of cash allocation issued Tuesday. The DBM said the approved budget will be sourced from the Malampaya Gas Fund under the special account in the General Fund. The 20 billion pesos will be tapped for the implementation of the government's Emergency Energy Security Program aimed at ensuring fuel availability, preventing supply shortage, and mitigating the impact of volatile global oil prices. It will fund the strategic procurement of fuel products including diesel, gasoline, and LPG in an effort to boost national fuel inventory, stabilize pump prices, and ensure uninterrupted operations across transport, logistics, agriculture, emergency response, and other critical sectors. The DBM said the program will be implemented by the Philippine National Oil Company Exploration Corporation, or PNOCEC, which has already initiated procurement activities to immediately augment domestic supply. The latest move comes amid escalating geopolitical tensions in the Middle East that have disrupted global oil production and distribution, posing serious risks to domestic fuel supply and the continuity of essential services. President Marcos Tuesday signed Executive Order 110, declaring a state of national energy emergency for a year to stabilize the country's energy sector. DBM Acting Secretary Rolando Toledo said the government would ensure that the fuel remains available, prices are moderated, and essential services are unhampered. Meanwhile, senators on Wednesday welcomed President Marcos's energy emergency declaration, but pressed for broader powers and concrete measures to curb rising prices. Senator Lauren Legarda called for immediate action, proposing to remove VAT on basic goods, fuel, and some electricity charges, and is considering a bayanihan-type law for time-bound powers. But Senator Bam Aquino expresses concern that the move may lack authority to impose price caps on essential goods and pushed for a broader emergency declaration. Aquino also urged the use of over 200 billion pesos in funds for targeted aid.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. announced that ferry and bus operators have agreed not to raise fees during the Holy Week travel period as the government works to mitigate the impact of rising fuel prices. In an interview with Bloomberg, President Marcos said the government is attempting to alleviate the consequences of fuel price rises on the riding public and the middle class as travel demand is likely to rise. Holy Week is one of the country's busiest travel travel seasons with a high number of people scheduled to visit the provinces. When asked about the government's response to fuel price charges, President Marcos said that subsidies are primarily granted to the transportation industry. To mitigate the impact of fuel price hikes, support will be offered to ship and bus operators and drivers as well as public transportation and delivery services. President Marcos issued Executive Order 110 on Tuesday, proclaiming a national energy emergency and citing threats to the country's energy security as a result of the ongoing Middle East conflict.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. has ruled out the aggressive use of the Philippines' foreign exchange reserves to defend the peso, describing the move as ineffective amid strong global forces driving the U.S. dollar. In an exclusive interview with Bloomberg, President Marcos stressed that while the government maintains a policy of supporting the peso within reasonable limits, spending the country's reserves to prop up the currency would be futile. President Marcos cited geopolitical tensions in the Middle East as key drivers of a stronger U.S. dollar and behind the local currency's continued depreciation. He also attributed dollar's resilience not just to its traditional role as a safe haven currency, but also to the United States' position as one of the world's largest oil producers. President Marcos admitted that the Middle East crisis has intensified pressure on currencies in middle-income economies such as the Philippines. Despite President Marcos saying peso depreciation has an offsetting effect through remittances from overseas Filipino workers, which are largely denominated in dollars. He, however, acknowledged that the gains are not enough to fully counterbalance the broader impact of a weaker currency. The temporary easing of tensions in the Middle East provided relief to the Philippine financial markets, with both the stock market and the peso recovering Tuesday. Philippine Stock Exchange Index (PSEI) rose 0.63% to 5,936.20 points, and the broader all shares by 0.57% to 3,295.23 points. Despite the challenges faced by the country, President Marcos remained confident that the Philippine economy can return to a growth trajectory of above 6%. This was after the country posted a 3% gross domestic product or GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2025, one of its weakest performance in the years outside of the pandemic period. President Marcos stressed the need to redraw everything amid the Middle East crisis, citing the need to boost investments and enhance the country's competitive position in high-value industries. He noted that the country's semiconductor sector, the Philippines' largest export in dollars, serves as a critical driver. He added that the shift from basic manufacturing toward more advanced design capabilities places the Philippines in a favorable position to benefit from emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and the expansion of data centers. President Marcos also emphasized ongoing efforts to improve the ease of doing business, including reforms to tax incentives and increased digitalization of government processes. Senators on Wednesday weighed about either borrowing or realigning existing funds to finance government measures amid the oil crisis. Senate President Vicente Sotto III said borrowing may be necessary in emergencies if used properly. Senator Risa Hontiveros, however, said borrowing should be a last resort, urging the use of available funds and realignment of spending. She also reiterated her push for the 52.8 billion peso supplemental budget to expand aid for transport workers, farmers, fisherfolk, and repatriated overseas Filipino workers, citing available funding sources and possible spending realignment.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. and his Japanese counterpart Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae agreed to work closely towards supporting the early de-escalation in the Strait of Hormuz as the Iranian blockade in the key waterway brings energy crisis across regions. The two leaders made the agreement during a summit telephone meeting in the evening of March 24. The Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs said to put emphasis on coordination and cooperation with the international community in ensuring the early de-escalation of the situation, with a particular focus on securing safe navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. At the Kapihan sa Manila Hotel on Wednesday, Foreign Affairs Secretary Maria Teresa Lazaro said President Marcos was also very candid in talking about the situation of the about 2.5 million Filipinos in the Middle East and emphasized that the government places their safety on top of its priorities. Beyond the Middle East situation, Lazaro said the two leaders also discussed the possibility of expanding the trilateral Japan-Philippines-United States cooperation. President Marcos declared a state of national emergency to address potential disruption in fuel supply and stabilize the country's energy sector. In Executive Order EO 110, signed March 24, President Marcos cited the escalating tensions in the Middle East as a key factor threatening global oil production and transportation, which could affect the Philippines as a net importer of petroleum products. Disruptions in critical supply routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, may constrain global fuel supply and trigger price volatility, posing risks to the country's energy security, according to EO 110.
Dateline Malacañang.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. said a reset in Philippine-China relations may be unavoidable as global geopolitical factors evolve, underlining Manila's opposition to war despite the current Middle East turmoil. In an interview with Bloomberg, President Marcos discussed ongoing changes in international relations caused by escalating global tensions. He recognized a broader transformation of international systems. President Marcos pointed out that the Philippines continues to separate its territorial conflicts with China from economic involvement. The Philippines and China have had a long-running territorial dispute in the West Philippine Sea, which is part of the large and resource-rich South China Sea that Beijing claims altogether. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration decided in favor of the Philippines, rejecting China's broad claims. However, Beijing has refused to comply with the momentous decision. President Marcos said discussions about the joint development of gas resources in contested areas of the West Philippine Sea are still ongoing. When asked about the growing crisis with Iran, President Marcos reiterated the Philippines' position. Despite evolving global tensions, the Philippines, a long-standing U.S. ally, has maintained its stance of supporting peace while defending national interests. In the same interview, President Marcos said that the Philippines is looking into getting petroleum supplies from Russia, the country's non-traditional trading partner. The attempt to diversify sources comes as the government declares a national energy emergency spurred by rising tensions in the Middle East, where the Philippines obtains the majority of its oil supply.
Dateline Malacañang.
In other Malacañang news, Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. led the send-off of 290 physicians under the Doctors to the Barrios or DTTB program, underscoring the government's push to strengthen healthcare access in underserved communities. Speaking at the Heroes Hall in Malacañang Palace, President Marcos said the deployment of the 43rd batch under the program comes at a critical time as residents of many rural and geographically isolated areas continue to face limited access to medical services. The latest batch marks the largest single deployment in the program's history, bringing the total number of deployed physicians under the initiative to nearly 3,000 since its establishment in 1993. President Marcos highlighted that the sustained implementation of the program led to a milestone in 2025. Despite this, the President emphasized the need to ensure continuity and accessibility of healthcare services. He added that the government is strengthening support systems for healthcare workers, including investments in training, safety, and well-being. The Doctors to the Barrios program deploys physicians to remote and underserved areas, including geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas or GIDAs, to improve primary healthcare delivery. President Marcos urged the new batch of doctors to uphold service and compassion in their assignment across the country.
Access to healthcare in rural and geographically isolated areas remains heavily constrained by limited resources, by distance, and the absence of medical professionals. Through the sustained implementation of this program, we have reached a historic milestone of 0 doctorless municipalities nationwide in 2025. Today also marks a significant achievement because now we have before us the largest single deployment in the program's history. Batch 43 is composed of 290 physicians. And it is an achievement, but it is not our endpoint yet. Hindi sapat na may doktor lamang sa isang lugar. Mahalaga ring matayak ang tuloy-tuloy at madaling maabot na serbisyo na naibibigay sa ating mga kababayan. More than just delivering healthcare, you are being deployed to help ensure that our people, especially those in the GIDAs, receive the services that they need. We continue to strengthen the National Health Workforce Support System. We will invest in your training, in your safety, and your well-being, so that you might be able to continue to serve with excellence, to heal with care, and to lead with compassion.
Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
That is all for today's Dateline Malacañang for Radyo Pilipinas World Service. This has been Bea Gaza-de Guzman.
From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.